A worker is killed on a construction site. Immediately, everyone starts focusing on the obvious questions. Was OSHA notified? What safety rules were violated? Who was responsible? Will there be a lawsuit? But in many cases, the most important question isn't what happened after the accident. It's what happened before it. Because when a worker dies, board investigators don't just examine the incident itself. They examine supervision, they examine training, they examine decision making, and they examine whether management exercised the level of oversight that regulators expect from licensed professionals. I've represented licensed professionals facing investigations where the issue wasn't whether someone intentionally broke the rules. The issue was whether proper supervision existed in the first place. And that's exactly what we're talking about today. My name is Nick Dogle. I'm a North Carolina attorney and the owner of North State Law here in Raleigh, North Carolina. My practice focuses exclusively on professional licensing. I represent licensed professionals across the great state of North Carolina when they receive complaints, face investigations, or find themselves dealing with disciplinary proceedings before licensing boards and regulatory agencies. If you're a general contractor, electrical contractor, plumber, HVAC contractor, or any other licensed construction professional, understanding how regulators evaluate supervision responsibilities after a serious accident is critical. Today we're going to discuss a recent worker fatality investigation that resulted in citations against multiple contractors, and more importantly, we're going to talk about why supervision often becomes one of the most important issues regulators examine after a tragedy occurs. One of the biggest misconceptions contractors have is believing that regulators are primarily looking for bad people. Most of the time, they are not. Regulators understand that construction is inherently dangerous. They understand that job sites are complex. They understand that even experienced workers can make mistakes. What regulators are trying to determine is whether the systems designed to protect workers were actually functioning. Were workers properly trained? Were hazards identified? Were supervisors actually paying attention? Was someone responsible for making sure safety procedures were followed? And perhaps most importantly, could this have been prevented? When a fatality occurs, regulators are often less interested in assigning moral blame and more interested in identifying preventable failures. That's why investigations frequently focus on supervision. Because from a regulatory perspective, supervision is one of the primary mechanisms for preventing injuries before they happen. And when supervision appears weak, inconsistent, or undocumented, investigators often begin asking much tougher questions. After a serious incident, many contractors immediately start thinking about the specific event. Board investigators usually think much broader. They're looking at the entire environment surrounding the incident. They want to know who was in charge. Was the license qualifier properly supervising? Who conducted inspections? Who assigned responsibilities? Who had authority to stop unsafe work? Who was expected to identify hazards? And who ensured that workers understood safety expectations? Consider a hypothetical. Let's say Mike. He owns a growing construction company and is the license qualifier for his company. Business is a booming. He's managing multiple projects at once. Because things are busy, he delegates many day-to-day responsibilities to site supervisors and foremen. That is not unusual. In fact, it's often necessary. But here's where problems begin. Mike assumes safety inspections are actually being completed. He assumes training meetings are occurring. He assumes supervisors are enforcing company policy, but he never verifies any of it. Then an accident occurs. Suddenly, investigators start asking questions. Where are their inspection records? Where's the training documentation? Who verified compliance? Who is responsible? And Mike discovers that assumptions don't hold much value during an investigation. Documentation does. Verification does. Oversight does. This is one reason why supervision becomes such a critical issue. Delegating responsibility is often appropriate, and a lot of times it's necessary for a growing business owner. Delegating accountability is not, though. This reminds me of a client matter I handled involving a worker fatality. Without getting into confidential details, because I don't do that, the issue wasn't that someone intentionally set out to violate safety requirements. The issue wasn't fraud, it wasn't dishonesty. The issue was, you guessed it, supervision. Like many growing trade businesses, there were layers upon layers of responsibility. Different individuals had different roles, certain tasks had to be delegated to somebody else, certain assumptions had to be made. And after the unfortunate fatality occurred, investigators began looking closely at who is responsible for overseeing the work. What often surprises contractors is that regulators don't necessarily focus on intent the way many people expect. Contractors frequently tell themselves, quote, "We didn't mean for this to happen. We weren't trying to violate the rules. We thought everything was being handled." And those facts I just mentioned may be completely true, but regulators frequently ask a different question. Not what did you intend, but what did you supervise? Not what did you believe was happening, but what can you demonstrate was actually happening? That's an entirely different analysis completely. And it's one that catches many licensed professionals off guard. Because good intentions do not always answer questions about oversight. Documentation and supervision usually do. This is where I see many professionals make mistakes. Not before the investigation, during the investigation. The first mistake is over-explaining. People obviously become nervous, that's reasonable to expect. But then they speculate and they guess and they try to fill in gaps in their memory. Unfortunately, investigators often treat those statements as important evidence. The second mistake is attempting to recreate records. Maybe documentation should have existed. Maybe it doesn't though. Sometimes people attempt to reconstruct information after learning an investigation has started. That can create significant credibility concerns. The third mistake is treating the matter as purely an OSHA issue. Many contractors focus exclusively on OSHA because that's the most visible agency involved. But depending on the circumstances, licensing boards, insurance carriers, local authorities, and civil attorneys may also become involved. Each may be asking different questions. Each may be reviewing different information. And actions taken in one proceeding can sometimes affect another. And they probably will, to be quite honest with you. That's why understanding the broader regulatory picture is so important. Most contractor discipline cases do not involve dramatic misconduct. They really don't, and thankfully they don't. They involved ordinary management failures that regulators believe created unreasonable risk. A supervisor wasn't adequately trained, a policy existed on paper, but it wasn't actually followed. Responsibilities were delegated without oversight. Hazards were reported, but not actually addressed. Documentation was incomplete. From the contractor's perspective, these may seem like operational issues. From a regulator's perspective, though, they can become evidence of inadequate supervision. And when a licensing board begins evaluating whether a licensee exercised appropriate responsibility, those details matter a lot. This is why I often tell contractors that compliance isn't just about having policies. It's about demonstrating that those policies are actively implemented. Record keeping is super important because after a serious incident, investigators don't just want to know what your procedures were. They want to know whether those procedures were actually being followed. Generally speaking, the contractors who navigate investigations most effectively are often the ones who focus on documentation, communication, and oversight before a problem ever occurs. Not because they expect an accident, but because they understand that if a question or questions are ever asked, they need reliable answers. In many cases, the issue isn't whether safety procedures and policies existed. The issue is whether anyone can prove they were actually followed. And that's an important distinction right there. And it's one that becomes incredibly significant when regulators begin reviewing supervision decisions. A worker fatality can trigger investigations from multiple directions. But while many contractors focus on the accident itself, regulators frequently focus on something completely different: supervision, oversight, documentation, and whether reasonable steps were taken to prevent the incident before it occurred. That doesn't mean every accident results in discipline. It certainly doesn't mean every contractor involved in an investigation did something wrong either. But it does mean that supervision often becomes one of the most important issues regulators examine. If you found this video helpful, consider subscribing to the channel. I regularly create educational content for North Carolina contractors and other licensed professionals about investigations, disciplinary actions, and issues that place professional licenses at risk. And if you'd like to continue learning about contractor investigations, be sure to watch my video on how homeowner complaints can turn into licensing board cases, even when the contractor believes the work was completed correctly. This video is general educational information about professional licensing in North Carolina. It is not legal advice. It does not create an attorney-client relationship, and every situation is different. Nothing here predicts the outcome of any particular case. Keep building North Carolina. Everybody have a great day. Bye-bye.